And we are live.
Fantastic. Hello there, viewers. We have a special treat for you tonight. We've got Dr. Eric Helms PhD, one of the world's foremost exercise physiologists, with us, and we are going to chat to him about various topics. A special treat for you tonight. We've got Dr. Eric Helms has 2 Masters of Science degrees, one in exercise science, one in sports nutrition. He's a PhD. He's currently in New Zealand from California originally, and we are just so fortunate to have him online with us today. Craig,
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, very fantastic. So how's it to the South African public?
Welcome on board. What's up, South Africa?
So yeah, as we probably just going to get straight into the questions, I suppose. So,
I'm good with that.
You're a vegan athlete at the moment, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm actually not vegan, but I am what I call, and actually what a common term is a flexitarian. So I have reduced my intake of animal products, but I'm definitely not vegan. That's something I probably couldn't swing. I'm closer to like lacto-ovo with occasional fish.
Okay. Because I mean, that was one of the things we, the vegan side of things, more plant-based diets taking off in South Africa. They're becoming a lot more popular. I've been approached to, come up with plans and advise on them. Not being vegan myself and not being totally vegetarian, it's not so much a challenge to come up with, that you've got all your 8 or 9 essential amino acids over the course of a day is quite easy. But how do you deal with, as an athlete, getting that muscle protein synthesis, 3 or 4 times a day within a meal, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the protein side of it. Sorry, go ahead. You cut out for a second.
No, sorry. I mean, if you were a vegan and you didn't have the option of fish or to add in some sort of dairy whey or to spike your leucine, 3 or 4 times a day, as a vegan, how do you approach that challenge for an athlete?
Yeah, the vegan diet is a lot harder if you want to be an athlete, especially a bodybuilder who typically is going to be taking in more protein than even other athletes. But it certainly can be done. You just have to be willing to be a little more experimental with the food you eat. So there are a lot of really good vegetarian and vegan protein sources out there now. So for example, a pea protein is pretty high in the branched chain amino acids and in leucine. Rice protein mixed with pea protein actually has a pretty similar profile to that of whey. It's been called, vegan's whey online a few times. It's like 70% pea, 30% rice. So that said, I wouldn't expect every single person out there who's vegan to be taking in a protein shake every time they need to get a protein bolus. So there are things like, eating like tempeh or mixed rice and beans, things like that. Those kind of traditional recommendations around mixing different protein sources still is true, still works. The issue is that it kind of forces you into a high carbohydrate diet. So really, it's not much of a problem while you're in a surplus, but when you're trying to actually cut, you can find it very difficult to find a place to pull calories from while maintaining a high protein intake. And I've found that vegan bodybuilders especially have to rely on protein supplements when they're dieting so that they can actually find a way to cut calories. And you guys know how it is when you're dieting. The last thing you want to do is consume liquid meals. You'd prefer to be chewing something. So it is a little more difficult for vegans, especially when it comes time to prep. But it can be done just from like a macronutrient perspective and a protein quality perspective. It's just your diet's a little limited, and it's a little, you run out of options as far as what are you going to do to cut calories. You have to kind of pick on fat, do more cardio, and rely on powders.
Yeah. Okay.
Fantastic. We've got another interesting one here. Is there a difference in training that you would recommend to females and males, and nutrition as well? Like, would you structure a plan for both strength training and for more physique differently for a man and a woman?
Yeah, this is cool. I think it's great that we're focusing more on the sex differences, because one unfortunate thing in exercise science and nutrition is that we don't have nearly the amount of research, especially relevant to like athletes, on men and women. We have a fair amount in certain areas, like postmenopausal women are studied a lot for those health reasons. But when it comes to like strength athletes, especially in bodybuilders, as you guys know, only in the last, say, decade has there been an increase in the participation by women in strength sports, which is awesome. So A, there's fewer of them to study, but B, they have been studied less. And a big part of that reason is that you have to, or you are recommended to do some controls on the menstrual cycle, which I'll explain why in a moment. And that can add burden to the researchers. So if you're working with a limited time period, a limited budget, if you're nervous about graduating on time, so much of research is done by master's students and PhD students. A lot of the times you'll opt for what is easier, which is just to study men, or at least you're less likely to get comments from your reviewers. So I think that's, while it's understandable, I think like we need to do something about that. The whole purpose of doing research is to try to help people. So we can't just keep being like, well, I got to graduate, like at some point we kind of need to focus a little more on getting the work done for our sisters in iron. So anyway, there are some differences, but before I get into them, I would say that the differences between individuals within a sex, so two different random guys that you grab off the street and have them start lifting and following a diet, or two gals, can be greater than the average difference between the sexes. So while there are sex-based differences, it's not like we're dealing with completely different species or anything like that. So on the training side, there is some limited data showing that women might be able to do more reps at a given percentage of 1RM. So like if you were to give them 70% of 1RM on average, they're going to be able to do more reps than, say, a male. Some of that is probably due to their body mass size. We did some research at FAU led by Dr. Mike Zerdos, where we found a correlation between doing less reps at 70% of 1RM with the higher your body mass got. And this is in men. So women are obviously smaller body mass in general compared to men. So some of that might just be a body mass thing. And it's interesting to figure out, why is that larger people don't do as many reps at a given percentage 1RM. It could just be that the stress per rep doesn't linearly scale with weight, kind of like how strength doesn't linearly scale with weight. Like if you are a super heavyweight and you can squat 2 times your body weight, that's actually pretty impressive. If you weigh 150 kilos and you're squatting a little over 300 kilos, that's more impressive than someone who weighs 50 kilos squatting 100 kilos, right?
Yeah.
So it's scaled differently. So that's part of it. But it also might be due to a few other things. Like there is some research showing that the stretch shortening cycle properties in the lower body in women is a little more, contributes a little more to force production. So it might be that they get a little more bounce out of the hole when they're doing, say, squats. Not so much the effect of having maybe more slow twitch fibers. I'm less confident in that finding just because we have so little high quality research on muscle fiber typing in women. And another interesting finding kind of in the same realm is that there are some studies showing women can perform without having a decrement in force production capacity like sooner. So for example, if you had them bench on Monday, they might be good to go to bench on Tuesday on average compared to a male. Could also be coming down to some of those same mechanisms. Or could also be related to estrogen having a protective effect against muscle damage. So maybe there's this, faster recovery process. So all in all, what does that mean? It means that you might need to benefit from, and they might be able to recover from more volume and more frequency on average. It's not going to be the kind of thing where it's like, yeah, we do 30 sets a day with Susie, but Tom only trains once every 2 weeks. It's not like that extreme by any means. But it is something that is shown in the literature that some coaches have mentioned they see the same thing with their lifters. So that's kind of the training side of it. There is some nutrition stuff, but a lot of it's related more to the menstrual cycle. So real simply, and the way I remember this is by the first letter of each phase. There's the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Yeah. So the follicular phase is first, luteal is last, F and L. Hey, we're learning binomics today, right? And there are some differences. So in the final phase of the menstrual cycle, women tend to, on average, have a higher energy expenditure. And on average, more of them report that they are hungrier, have more cravings during this period. And there's also some data showing they don't recover from training quite as well. So, what does that mean for the practitioner? I've had clients who I have them in a steeper deficit during the period where they're less hungry, and then more of a refeed or closer to maintenance when they are hungrier, just to kind of reduce total diet fatigue and kind of increase the sustainability of the diet. I will note that this is not by any means a consistent finding I've seen in practice. The average menstrual cycle is supposed to last 28 days and have these distinct phases, and ovulation is supposed to mean that you're a little bit stronger on that day. But there's a lot of variation in the menstrual cycle among women. So it's kind of that thing where it's like, yeah, research on average says this, but you really want to play it to the individual.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then I think there's one other thing I want to say. So you guys are probably familiar with the research showing that at least for hypertrophy, you can train with low loads or high loads, and you can get, if so long as you match for total hard sets or volume, you're going to get similar hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Cool. So there's very little research on women on this topic. In fact, I'm only aware of enough study. Loads produced a lot more hypertrophy than low loads in women. So while I'm not going to hang my hat on just a single study, I'm a little less confident that if you were to program low loads for women, it would be as effective in hypertrophy, which is kind of unfortunate because you see that the general social message, if there was kind of some stuff lingering from the 80s, is women should do low load, high reps, which actually might be less effective than it would be in even a man. So women probably need to be training in more of the traditional hypertrophy ranges and then heavier, and maybe at least until we get more data, I would probably not be giving them like 20 to 30 rep sets because it might not be as effective.
Yeah.
So you stick more into like the 8 to 12 rep range for now.
Yeah, I think that rep range is safe until one study could just be the statistical randomness of the world. So I would love to see more research done in this area, but because there's a potential for that being less effective, I'd probably like 15 and under for the most part.
I think you guys also, with Greg Knuckles, you brought out a good article on the Mass Research Review on women training and sort of the hormonal aspect of it as well.
Yeah, if you guys want to check out, Greg did a great job. It's actually freely available to everybody on Stronger by Science. He did a basically like a meta-analysis on rates of training progress in women, and then noted a lot of these same things I was talking about. So there's a really cool finding there that while men start with the higher baseline of muscle mass, women, not by a lot, but by a little bit, seem to actually gain strength a little faster and gain muscle mass a little faster. Yeah. So so I don't know the mechanism behind it, but math. So I can't argue with it. So
it's kind of cool. Crazy. We got the exactly. Wonder Woman.
Exactly right.
To step away a little bit from the strength side of it, and this could be answered by Andrew or by Andrea, like any of you guys. For the people who are more into the physique side of training, so like bodybuilding,
more for aesthetics.
Yeah. Would you say that there's a difference in how you would structure your training for a female and a male?
In terms of which body parts you'd prioritize, like less chest work, more glute ham work, for somebody who's going to be competing in the bikini, any fitness divisions, those type of things.
Well, just from my side, a lot of the women that I train, they have breast implants. So for them to do like a heavy bench day, doesn't work so well. So yeah, it's on a case-to-case basis, but in general, most of the women that I train don't usually do much chest work. Outside of that, it's pretty standard. Maybe incorporating sort of lower body training twice a week, obviously. I usually do sort of one strength day and then one sort of hypertrophy day.
Yeah.
In general.
Right. What is the next one?
I'm sorry, I'm just lost my place on my.
There's so many.
It's all good. That's why you have someone edit it after the fact, right?
Let's talk about the maybe just touch up on the hub. Is this the powerlifting, the volume and frequency one that we were going to speak with Eric? The debate that he had with Mike Israel, the reps, sets, volumes. Should we touch up on that one?
I mean, a lot of Eric's work that I've read about, you tend to work, when determining volume per body part per week, you like to work in reps, 40 to 70 reps being effective per body part per session. How do you determine what is an effective rep? Out of that 70, is it 65% of one rep max and above? Is there a threshold? And then as long as you're working within that rep effort or intensity or load, that would count as your volume per that workout.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I totally know where you're coming from. And this is actually something that is going to change in the second edition of my muscle and strength pyramids. So when I wrote those in late 2015, we didn't yet have some of the meta-analyses that have come out literally in the last 2 years, looking at the number of sets performed. So there's a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld and colleagues where they looked at the dose response of number of sets performed, which are almost always to failure in the research, and the relationship with hypertrophy. And there's also a meta-analysis by Ralston that did the same thing, but looking at changes in strength. And there's also just been a lot of accumulation and awareness around the research. It's been mentioned before that whether you're doing a set of 8 or a set of 30, if you take that set to a similar level of effort on a set-by-set basis, if all else is equal, it'll probably hypertrophy. So the reason I used reps per session per group before was the only data we had. I was working off of a paper by Wernbaum from 2007 where they kind of they analyzed their data based on reps. And, I came up with a figure of 80 to 210 reps per muscle group per week is where you want to be. And if you think about the average number of reps that are done in a set in the literature, it's right around 10. So it's basically like 8 to 20 sets, which kind of lines up pretty nicely with not only my anecdotal experience of kind of the range to be in for most muscle groups, but also lines up with the dose response research. So in Ralston, they found that the highest strength gains were found between 5 to 12 sets per movement as maximizing strength, and not enough data to know if higher than that would be even better. And then in the Schoenfeld study, there was this graded dose response upwards from 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and then 10 plus. 10 plus, unfortunately, meaning anywhere from 10 to, thousands based on the lack of data, right? So what that means is that we see a pretty strong dose response relationship. We know it falls off somewhere. The question right now that we're all trying to answer is, where does it fall off? So there was a quote unquote German. So there was studies who were, I would say, pretty barely trained. They were benching body weight on average. And that's, plus or minus the standard deviation, which means some of those guys couldn't bench body weight who were in this study. So not a very highly trained group. And one group was doing like 15 sets per muscle group, and one was doing 30. The group doing 30 sets per muscle group didn't actually have a statistical increase in growth, which means they were doing so much that they were just in a constant state of recovery. The group doing 15 sets per muscle group did grow and made strength gains that were all statistically significant. So at least in pretty early stage novices, we can see that doing something like 30 sets per muscle group on average is probably far too much. But I think it's a very different story for well-trained individuals. James Krieger, who, if you guys aren't familiar with him, definitely give him a follow and check him out. He's the man. He is the one who basically does most of the data analysis for a lot of the meta analysis that Schoenfeld, Aragon, and he put out. He just recently updated his own personal, like, in-house meta analysis based on a study that has not yet come out yet, and found that, at least in trained individuals, man, that number is actually pretty friggin' high, to where hypertrophy keeps responding to volume on average. So, you know, where that number is, we're still trying to figure it out, but a recommendation like 10 to 30 sets might be more reasonable for someone who's been in the gym a decent amount of time. And that kind of forces you into doing something like specialization cycles, or using more accessory movements that are less taxing. Like, obviously you wouldn't be like, well, I'll just do 20 sets of squats. Welcome to we'll see you in the emergency room, right? So some of that, you have to really think about the application side of it, periodization. Some of Mike Israetel's concepts, where he's kind of talked about working towards a higher level of volume than recycling that. I think that makes a lot of sense, versus just trying to stay at that rep rate or that number of sets all the time. But for hypertrophy, I would say the easiest way to look at it is number of hard sets, as simplistic as that sounds. Sets that are somewhere between 6 to 20. You can probably count them on an equal basis if they're all reasonably near failure. We're talking like maybe 3 or 4 reps away and not further than that. I think you could probably put them on equal footing. For strength, it's a different. What I know of the data and what I can share, it doesn't have that same curve where just more volume endlessly results in greater strength. And that makes sense, because specificity for strength is about the load. You could even make an argument that, maybe a heavy single at like a 9 RPE is going to net greater strength gains than maybe doing 5 at 75%, even though it's a lot more volume in the latter one, just because it's not as specific to a 1RM. So you're probably going to end up with a more moderate number of sets if your goal is strength, and it might be better. We don't have the data to tell exactly what these numbers are yet, but it might make a lot more sense to prescribe like number of sets in different intensity zones, something kind of like the Prilepin's chart kind of approach.
We've just got a question from one of our viewers at the moment, just based on training itself. It's something that I prescribe or use quite a bit myself, is depending on the exercise itself, but to only use the last set of an exercise, generally an isolation exercise, where you would go to complete failure and not do complete failure from the start. So in other words, using the RPE scale, sit 7, 8 for the majority of your sets, and then take 1, 2, 3 sets during the course of your workout, when it's safe to do so, to an absolute failure of RP10.
To ensure your volume gets
so that you get the more overall volume, per workout, instead of fatiguing the muscle so much too early, and then your volume just drops off for that workout from there.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something I also do, and I recommend. Like, if you talk to the people who tend to recommend pretty low frequencies, like 1 time per week, they almost invariably are pushing a lot of sets to failure, and typically doing so on movements you'd be like, oh wow, you take sets of squats to failure. Like, that's pretty hardcore. They come from kind of that camp where it's like, how could you possibly train legs again 3 days later? Like, I can't even walk 2 days later. Like, I'll see you in the halls of Valhalla. I am an animal pack ab. They're that kind of mentality.
We're not all complex, are we?
Exactly. And so talking these individuals into stopping 2 reps shy of failure is like counter to their soul. And I get that, but I really think it makes a lot more sense given what we know typically determines that dose response. And that we know you get pretty close to max activation when you're getting close to failure. And it may not be worth that trade-off There was a study where they had relatively low trained individuals do 3 sets of 10 to failure at I think 75-ish% of 1RM. And they compared that to a group doing 6 sets of 5. So they're stopping at like a 5 RPE with the same percentage 1RM. So the same total volume load. You can make an argument that maybe the 3x10 had more effective reps, but I don't think it'd be that much of a difference, to be honest. And it was almost like a 2-fold or 3-fold recovery time course for the folks doing 3 sets of 10 to failure. I don't think it's going to be for someone who's used to training hard with a lot of volume to failure, like if you come from a bodybuilding background, but certainly it'll be more in terms of the time course of recovery. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, let's say you take your typical leg day, you come in and you do like a squat or a leg press, then you do like an RDL or a deadlift, and then you do leg extension, leg curl, calf raise. That's like, stock standard leg day, right? It probably makes a lot of sense to be somewhere in like a 6 to 9 RPE on this compound first couple movements, and then 7 to 9 RPE on the first couple sets, and then taking that last set of leg extensions, last set of leg curls, and last set of calf raises to the house. No problem. I don't think one set of leg curls to failure is going to I can never train again. So you can kind of like you said, you can get the benefit of pushing it a little closer to the red line and making sure you fatigue every fiber without necessarily, getting that recovery cost of pushing a set of squats to failure where, using the toilet the next day is a workout. So
just another question. Sorry, going back to female physiology from somebody on the reading. Can women who train or lift heavy weights on a regular basis, does it have any effect on their testosterone production?
Good question. So there are acute and then chronic changes in testosterone in both men and women in response to training. The acute changes are actually like typically you see an increase in cortisol and drop in testosterone. Like if you were just purely looking at changes in hormone markers, you'd be like, no one should be lifting weights. It's terrible. But chronic, it's a lot different. You start to see these kind of slow rises, and the magnitude is different in men and women, but they're relatively similar in how they operate. I will say though that there is that the hormones don't do what we typically think of. Like we kind of have this archetype in our head of testosterone good, estrogen bad, but GH good, IGF good, and that's about the extent. Like that's like 90% of armchair forums, like endocrinologists who lift weights. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Estrogen for the most part, a lot more complicated. So estrogen for the most part has like positive effects in muscle and in the body. And like unless you're looking at like super physiological levels or way out of hormone balance, like if you were to come off of a cycle of steroids and not do PCT, you can have problems. But the kind of like estrogen response you see to training and the normal levels that you see in men and women are beneficial primarily, especially in the way they affect the tissue we care about, like muscle and connective tissue. Testosterone, while it does impact kind of that baseline level of muscle mass you might have in the normal occurring levels that we see in men and women, it doesn't have a huge impact like you might think. And one way I kind of emphasize to people to not worry about testosterone too much is just to kind of put it in position compared to other factors. Like if you look at WNBF Worlds or IFPA Yorton Cup or all the natural feds at the highest level, we're seeing guys and gals winning the world championships, placing top 5 who are in their late 30s to early 40s. And while they probably are outliers who have high testosterone levels normally, they're certainly lower than when they were 20 years younger, and it's not the factor that is making it whether or not they can do well. The fact that they've lifted 20 years of weights is why they're at that level. So the changes in testosterone and estrogen over time from weightlifting are there. They're relatively minor, but they're probably not playing a huge role regardless of your sex. That's kind of my answer to that question.
Yeah, just stick to this one. We've got another one staying on the hormonal impacts at the moment, but this is more going back towards the vegetarian vegan style of dieting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any negative or positive hormonal impacts of, following a vegetarian or a vegan diet? I think this probably is moving more towards the over-reliance on soy, and the reputation that soy has kind of probably unduly got to boost protein.
Yeah, so there's mixed data on the effect of soy on estrogen, and it being potentially maybe too high or not high. There's even some research showing that soy proteins and soy isoflavones can be beneficial for women, and maybe not so much for men. But I would agree it's an undue alarmism around taking soy. However, what is unfortunately a little more consistently shown is that sperm count might go down on a high soy diet in men. So, you might see that as good or bad depending on your lifestyle. But that's something I wouldn't want to mess with too much. So what I typically recommend is, hey, let's keep it to like 1 serving of soy per day. That's highly unlikely to have any potential issue for men. And then women probably don't need to worry about it quite as much. So that's kind of answering the obvious question people typically have related to hormones in vegetarians and vegans. But other potential hormonal issues can come up, not directly as a consequence of just I've decided to not eat meat, but more so due to potential micronutrient deficiencies in vegans. So if you are a vegan, I would highly recommend doing a number of things. One, I would probably get your iron levels checked just to see where your ferritin is at. And I would start supplementing with B12 no matter what. That's kind of like if you're not eating meat, that's something you should be supplementing with, kind of standard. And you probably also want to get your vitamin D levels. But in the Western world, as we're spending more and more time indoors, we're getting less and less sun exposure, and vitamin D deficiency is becoming more and more prominent. And that indirectly has an impact on your hormonal levels. So if you are vitamin D deficient, you can see changes in your hormonal status, which are linked to greater incidences of illness, poorer recovery from training, and even potentially decreased performance. There's some research showing that. So I would probably get some blood work done, check your iron and vitamin D, and then not even consider. If you're vegan or vegetarian, you probably should be supplementing with B12, and then potentially looking into supplementing with anything that you might have a shortfall in your diet. The big ones, not that you should just automatically take them. Like I said, I always believe in blood work first, but B12, vitamin D, calcium, iron, zinc, and iodine are kind of the ones I would focus on primarily. And I would also highly consider taking creatine. Creatine tends to be pretty beneficial for all lifters, but there's research showing it's even more effective in vegetarians and vegans because we primarily get it from meat. And it has not only effects on muscle performance, but also on neurology. So it can be it's healthy for your brain. It's neuroprotective effects and can improve cognition and memory if you are essentially deficient, which most vegetarians and vegans are at baseline. So those are, to kind of cap off that discussion on vegans and vegetarians, you have to pay a little more attention, not just to protein, but also on the micronutrient side of it, especially if you're vegan.
Fabulous. Eric, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Shredded by Science Academy that you're involved in? A bit of
Absolutely.
You to plug yourself if you want to.
I will always plug myself. Absolutely. So
I think you want to hear about these books coming out.
The books, like, we are just waiting for those.
Cool. I will shamelessly plug away. So the Shredded by Science Academy started by some great people. Luke Johnson. He is the brains behind that, or at least the business behind that. Lawrence Judd is also heavily involved with that, and it is essentially a educational resource for personal trainers or new personal trainers, whether it's something they have been doing or are going to be continuing doing in the future. It's a 1-year-long course where there's 5 modules. You get the basics, fundamentals of personal training at the front end, and then you get kind of the business side of personal training at the end. And in the middle, I am fortunate enough to teach a module on training bodybuilders. And then my colleague, Dr. Mike Zerdos, has a module on training powerlifters. So it's very kind of specific to the lifting culture if you're a trainer with that kind of focus, which is cool. We have intakes in, I believe, February and September every year. If you follow Shred by Science on Instagram, you can kind of stay up with that and kind of see when we're doing that if you're interested in being involved. And if you live in the UK, you can do kind of a bolt-on course in person, and it actually can get you personal training insurance and is a legit certification there. That's not internationally true, but at least for the folks who are in Europe, Western Europe and the UK, that's an option.
And where can people buy your pyramid books as they stand at the moment?
Easy to buy. You just go to muscleandstrengthpyramids.com, and those are my pieces of work that I'm pretty proud of. Just they kind of outline the hierarchy of importance, hence the pyramid structure for both training and nutrition, and they're fully referenced. There's probably 100+ references in both books, sample training plans, a lot of resources, and we are working on the second edition. Myself, Andy, and Andrea, my co-authors, that we're trying to get out by the end of the year is our target.
Well, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've read hundreds of books on training, and I must admit that those two are by far my favorites.
Wow.
Just not just from like a easy, I wouldn't say an easy read, but just hard enough that you know, the normal person can understand and take something away from it, and just practical enough that if you just apply what you've done, it'll take you 90% of the way to your physique or your powerlifting goals. And both with nutrition and with that, and you can sidestep, you know, the 10% we're still arguing about. And, you know, you can just do the 90% of what we know actually works, you know, and go from there. And I really, really, really thoroughly enjoyed them. Totally. So I do recommend them to.
Honored to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely, I agree. I mean, Eric, I think also with Eric, you know, you come from such a high academic background and you're high intellect as well. It's just the way you present yourself in such a subtle, smooth flowing approach, and you're explanatory, the way you just make it easy for people to understand. Just, you know, it really separates you a lot from a lot of the others, you know. So kudos to that, my friend. And you're doing a great job in the industry. And also want to talk about your involvement with the mass research review with Greg Knuckles in it. That's pretty awesome. I've subscribed to that, and we actually had a lot of other people subscribe to it as well. That's another one, another good job. Well done on that one. That's really brilliant stuff that you guys bring out every month. Okay.
We've got one.
Cut out for a second there. Sorry.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry.
Did you get me? Did you hear what I said?
I think you were plugging mass, and then I didn't hear anything.
I said congratulations on the mass review that you guys have brought out with Greg Knuckles every month. I've actually subscribed to that since you guys brought it out, and actually got a lot of people to subscribe to it as well. That's brilliant. Well done on that one too. You bring out some really good stuff on that. So awesome stuff.
Thank you very much
for everything that you do.
Hey, I appreciate the you sharing that with the listeners, and also if you dig, man, that's something that tells we're serving the right customers. So I appreciate it.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you guys are doing a great job, Eric. You keep on doing it. I mean, you know, we're trying to educate and get the evidence-based community here in South Africa, you know, and get guys like you, get guys like James on board, you know, doing these shows and podcasts. And just, you know, it's always lovely hearing, you know, different views and everybody's, you know, opinions from things and the research and what you have to say. Guys like James, guys like Lane Norton. Hopefully we'll get Ellen Aragon soon. Lar McDonald, as you know, as a character within himself. So yeah, it's just awesome.
We'd hope to actually
I think
to do a seminar. We're just working on that at the moment, and finally
awesome. That sounds great, man. I'm definitely definitely down. And I think you guys are. It's an important thing to do to try to bring good quality information to your geographic location. And like, I think that's a very noble cause, and I hope you guys keep being successful with it. I'm happy to be a small part of it.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate it and honored, Eric. Really, really are.
Two-way street.
We've got one that we get very often. So I'm just going to read this straight as the person asked it. I went to see my kidney specialist, and at some point he pointed out that additional creatine, other than what you get from your food, isn't good for your kidneys, as it creates a buildup and then can have a negative impact on your kidneys. Do you think this statement is true, or do you think it's uninformed? The creatine thing.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon that people will get their blood work done and their creatinine levels will be elevated above the normal range. So creatinine can be, but is not always a sign of kidney issues, right? It is the byproduct of when creatine is broken down. So we have research to show that if you come in close proximity to a training session, that it will be elevated. More often than not, when I see a lifter who is otherwise apparently healthy and has presented with high creatinine levels, it's because they got blood work done in close proximity to a training session. And they will often also have like elevated liver enzymes, which comes with processing the byproducts of muscle breakdown. So while you definitely don't want to dismiss every time you have high creatinine levels as, it's just because I was lifting weights, like that could be something serious. If it's slightly over that range and you are healthy, I would probably get the blood test done again. And maybe after 48 hours of not training, just rejig your weekly schedule so you have a large period of not having trained. Jack your water intake up on that day to make sure everything's cycling properly. And that will give you a much better picture of whether or not that's something that you should truly be concerned about. Creatine on creatinine levels, I would think it would probably elevate a little bit. I mean, creatinine is the breakdown product of creatine, and you're taking additional creatine. Whether that is actually unhealthy or a true kidney risk, or it's just going to elevate that marker, I think is a question that is worthy of asking. I have not seen any evidence in anyone with two healthy kidneys that creatine is harmful, especially if taken within the normal dosing ranges. So I don't know if it's necessarily uninformed, but I would say it's specific to the situation, and always get a second opinion.
Yeah.
It's the
Eric, I just want to touch up one question with you. I know you know the diet breaks and the refeeds have become a big talk of late, and you've I think it's because of you. A lot of the people have sort of got into the taking more longer diet breaks in terms of like 2-3 weeks of diet breaks. Can you just maybe elaborate more in terms of the benefits of it and what's the research saying? Have we got a conclusive answer in terms of does it really have a positive effect? And I see the diet breaks has a longer sustainable fat loss success. Can you just maybe touch up on that subject? Because a lot of our viewers talk about the refeeds and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. First, you got to give credit where credit's due. The first time I read about a diet break was Lyle McDonald. He started writing about it. I think I have probably helped to repopularize it because we've seen a lot of success with our clients implementing it with them. It's been kind of like hit or miss. They just don't have the kind of impact we always hoped they would. They work well with some people, but it's definitely not consistent. We've seen in our practice at 3J, the diet breaks are effective with damn near everyone with their, like when I say damn near everyone, I mean contest prepping. I don't have a ton of experience using them in the general population, so I can't speak to that. So what research do we have to support that is actually coming out now. There was a recent study called the Matador study, which is some ridiculous acronym that I can't remember what it stands for, but cool study in that they had a group that was basically doing a 2-on, 2-off diet break diet. So what that means is that they were actually eating at maintenance, controlled calorie intake. So it's not just like pizza. It's like in the 2-week diet break, they had a specific target number of calories. It was dictated by an actual BMR test. So it was done in laboratory conditions, and they were checked on a pretty regular basis. So it's pretty tightly controlled. And the group that was doing the 2x2 diet, while the total length of the study was twice as long as the group that was just dieting 16 weeks straight. That's just kind of the nature of taking diet breaks. The total time spent, the same amount of time in a deficit. The group that was doing the diet breaks had less of a reduction in their basal metabolic rate, and lost more fat mass in the same time period. And when they were brought back in for the recall, I want to say a year after or 6 months after the initial diet, they had sustained more fat loss. So it could be beneficial for long-term maintenance of fat loss, because basically you're getting practice at maintenance every on a cyclical period, and also that physiological side of it. The benefit of having less of a reduction in your energy expenditure means that when you go back to your normal eating habits, that will result in less rebound fat mass gains. So that said, that was on overweight and obese individuals. I am currently involved with a group out of Western Australia, led by a PhD student, Jackson Pios, and he is studying the same or similar protocol, but less frequent refeeds in athletes. So I'm pretty excited to see what comes out of that. And then on the refeed side of it, one thing we have, longer refeeds to get to a diet break, the more effective they seem to be. So I will often use 48-hour refeeds with my clients, especially if they're prepping. And there's a few reasons for that. The first research that I saw that influenced my decision to do that was some of the actual refeed research that's out there is not on 24-hour refeeds. It's on like 72-hour refeeds, having an impact on leptin and energy expenditure. And then some research on women looking at LH pulsatility, so their luteinizing hormone. This is a marker you can use in clinical settings to detect when menstrual cycle irregularities are going to happen. So luteinizing hormone was not corrected, if you will, that drop in pulsatility after a diet with one huge refeed day. So they gave women something like 4,500 calories on average, and it didn't seem to restore their menstrual cycle function or the marker for that. But another study where they aided maintenance for a couple days did. So it tells you that at least for women on the hormonal side of things, that there is not only a magnitude of energy intake, but also a time course where energy availability needs to be corrected. This makes sense from like an evolution. If your tribe is out on the Bering Strait and you're all starving to death, and you find one animal, it's not like, oh great, let's all burn a bunch more calories now that we found a rabbit. No, you probably need a sustained amount of calories for the tribe to survive and to actually procreate and to have children, right? So at least that's my armchair mechanism-based understanding of it. So anyway, in addition to that, and this is hopefully going to get published soon, right now it is just an abstract. There was a study done by Bill Campbell in his lab with some of his grad students where they found greater muscle retention on a diet where they were using a 48-hour refeed versus a one-day refeed with, I think, matched deficit over the course of a week. So that's pretty exciting. It kind of, I like it because it says that what I was doing with my athletes was correct. So my biases are confirmed. I am smart and I'm happy. So
just to confirm that the refeed, you would do Monday to Friday, and then you would do a 48-hour refeed Saturday, Sunday, or is the refeed period individualized? So it could be every 2 to 3 weeks, or is it, for every 7 to 14 days you would consider doing a 48-hour refeed and then being a bit more aggressive in between?
Yeah, good question. So I think you can modulate that theoretically by kind of body fat level. So because I work with competitors, I'm dealing with people and they're working to get from normal to lean or lean to leaner or like normal period, I typically just start them off with a weekly 2-day period. They have 2 days of maintenance in a row. I think I put adherence always kind of above everything else, and sustainability. So for example, if there is one day of the week where, let's say it's their anniversary and they want to put their refeed on that day to create a buffer so they can go out to eat with their spouse. And then we have the second part of that 2-day refeed comes 3 days later. It's not a 48-hour refeed. They just have 2 24-hour refeeds split up in that week. I think that's fine. You're still getting most of the benefits. So I tend to individualize it to some degree. It also doesn't have to be Saturday, Sunday. Like, for example, if someone has a work schedule that requires them to train 2 days in a row with relatively high volume, I might put them on those 2 days or shifted the day prior so that they're coming into each one of those workouts with, topped up glycogen stores. So I think you should consider, yes, we know that a 48-hour refeed is probably better than a 24-hour refeed because it's basically a longer time period, not in a deficit. And how does that interact with your training, their schedule, and their lifestyle? I think I would put slightly above, and it's got to be 48 hours. But you could make an argument for someone who's overweight that they just don't need to try to give that kind of leptin rebound as frequently, and other markers as well. So you could do it every 2 weeks or something like that. I think that's a reasonable decision to make, for sure.
I've often seen where, I think it was a podcast of yours I was listening to, where during comp prep you would do a week of maintenance for every 8 weeks of hard dieting. I think it was just a general suggestion. I have seen some stuff coming out at the moment where it's 3 to 4 weeks of very aggressive dieting, and then they take 2 weeks of maintenance. So depending on how aggressive and how long that aggressive point was, that maintenance period could be a week to 3 weeks.
I think that's very reasonable.
Lengthen the time of your prep. So obviously, prep would go from 16 weeks to 32. But it would be probably a healthier prep, more controlled prep, and something that more adherent.
Yeah, I think a couple things I want to point out there is, there's a lot of ways we could structure it, because this is very much just kind of emerging data, and we don't know what's the best way to do it. We probably won't know what the best way is based off of research. We'll probably figure that more out with each individual, but we know what it's doing, and let's play with it. But I think it does make a lot of sense, because we have such a high conditioning standard in bodybuilding now. Like, if you're not bringing some pretty intense conditioning to the stage, you're just not going to do well. So that's hard to get to. And it also has quite the recovery phase that eats into your off season. So, you have to do something to try to cross the finish line as minimally beat up as possible, and also reaching that great condition. So that just means longer preps in general, but maybe if we can maintain more muscle mass and more energy expenditure and more sanity, what can we do to help that? And there is a trade-off with diet breaks, because as much as a diet break is a break from a deficit, it's not a break from tracking. It's not a break from looking in the mirror and thinking, am I going to be ready on time? From being nervous about the fact that maybe you plateaued, but now you've got a diet break scheduled, and you just have to kind of trust your coach or trust the process. So there is still some stress associated with it. So I think you have to consider that it does lengthen the entire time frame that someone is thinking about getting shredded, which is a non-negligible part of the stress of contest prep. But also, on the other hand, you are getting a bit of an efficiency advantage. It's not just like, if I didn't use diet breaks, I'd be dieting 16 weeks. And if I dieted every other week, I'd be dieting 32, because you're actually having more efficient fat loss. So it might be more like 16 versus like 28. So it's not like a perfect doubling, because you're actually burning more calories and maintaining more muscle mass, and hopefully shifting the ratio of fat mass to lean mass lost more towards fat mass. That means that those diet breaks will help you out a little bit. So if you do it like every 8 weeks, maybe you're only lengthening your actual time you would need to diet if you were to compare to your twin who was just doing a straight deficit by a few weeks, versus every single time is adding a week.
Do you recommend aggressive or moderate calorie deficits for fat loss? One of the questions sent in by a viewer.
Good question. I think it depends on the situation and the time course that you're going to be doing it for. So if you're talking about general population working with obese people, There is some research showing that fast weight loss initially predicts success in the long run. And this makes sense. Like if you have 200 pounds to lose and your nutritionist is like, we're going to lose a pound a week because that's healthy. It's like, oh my God, that's 200 weeks before I like the way I look. Like, fuck it. I'm just going to keep eating Doritos. But you know, when you have someone who is obese, they can actually handle a high calorie deficit better than someone who's lean because they've got so much fat tissue to mobilize. If you catch them while they're motivated and they start to see large changes in scale weight initially, that can build some self-efficacy on the front end that's going to help them in the long run. So, you know, what that might look like is not the entire time they're freaking gangbusters going as fast as they can, Biggest Loser style, but maybe for a month or two, while they're motivated, while they're not suffering on the diet, and while they're not feeling the effects too much. And, you know, as a clinician, you should be paying attention to, hey, how are you feeling on the diet? And like, you know, if they're feeling a lot of diet fatigue and they're dreading it and they're having to exert a lot of willpower to stay on this high calorie deficit, that's the time point at which you bring them to a moderate deficit. So I think to kick off a fat loss phase for someone who is significantly overweight or obese, I think an extreme, or not extreme, a high calorie deficit where you're losing maybe, 2%, 3% of your body weight per week, especially in someone who's significantly overweight, can be effective. And then you bring that back down to the more reasonable range of like 0.5 to 1.5% of body weight for the rest of the diet. I think for athletes and bodybuilders, especially, and people trying to maintain as much lean mass as possible, you probably don't want to play with anything faster than like losing about 1% of your body weight per week. So I would classify that as a moderate deficit.
Yeah, absolutely. We have two more questions, I think, before we going to close.
Cool.
Eric, how do you think the understanding of how to structure workouts has changed since the 60s? The guys in the golden era, did they just have it right? Did they perhaps understand exercise physiology a lot better than what we think they did? Or is it just that they had fantastic genes and lucky for them it worked out well?
So I love this question.
Eric, just before you guys, I want to pause you there
Yes.
for a second. You're doing some awesome stuff with what you're doing, bringing back sexy back from the 60s and 70s, or all those posts you're doing. I love it, man, because that's my period. But I mean, I just love those techniques and all that info you bring out. Keep on doing it. It's awesome. And I've still got to send you some stuff, which I'm sending you soon.
Yeah, I appreciate that, dude. Yeah, I love the stuff I have two motivations for why I post this stuff. Is one, it's just the awesomeness of remembering our roots and that we stand on the shoulders of giants and appreciating, the roots of our culture. And second, it's for the people who think you can't even get abs without anabolic steroids, or that you can't bench 315 without gear. And just reminding people that Marvin Eder in like the late 40s when he was 18 was benching as much as like a world champ with the flat back is today. So maybe you just need to quit being a league and lift some weights. So just cool stuff like that. Seeing people who had a higher fat-free mass index than Doug Miller, in 1917 is always a good reminder for people, maybe just to not be so skeptical, So anyway, good question. Did the golden era guys have it right? Well, there's actually a few different training trends that happened over time. So things started off with basically a time period where weight training was so unique that it was literally a circus act, right? So there was not a gym on every corner. And this was these strongman performers, it was their income and it was their lifestyle. They would travel. Yeah, there was men and women. Absolutely. Yeah. So there was strong men, strong women. There was Eugene Sandow. There was also Sandwina. There was a rich culture around traveling circus acts that would have a strong person, man or woman, and they would have to basically perform a number of acts on a regular basis. So they were training low volume, high intensity, full body lifts multiple times per week without issue, without thinking about overtraining. So the kind of doing mini Bulgarian method for a crowd with like these overhead lifts. And in the process of that, they would also frequently be doing things like hand balancing, gymnastics, and what was called muscle control, which was basically the progenitor of posing routines, where you would actually try to isolate muscles and contract them and show unique things like things that are typically not thought to have voluntary control, like isolating your transverse abdominis and while doing a vacuum, and then showing like gistro oblique and stuff like that. Weird stuff, but cool stuff. So that was kind of the early vaudeville style performing stuff. When bodybuilding shows became a thing around the turn of the century, and then especially when they popped up in the States in the 20s and 30s, and especially in the 40s, there was some types of training that emerged. So there was essentially a very blended culture between weightlifters and bodybuilders. The early Mr. America contests would happen in concert with lifting nationals. And then weightlifting was also a bit of a different sport. It wasn't just snatch and clean and jerk. It had dumbbell variants for a while. It used to be part of track and field until the 20s. And it didn't really solidify until like the 40s into being a 3-lift comp, snatch, clean, and military press. The equivalent of what do you bench, bro, back in the 40s all the way through the 70s was what do you press, bro? Like what's your overhead press? Because it was one of the main Olympic lifts. It was the strength lift in Olympic weightlifting, and powerlifting didn't come out until the late 50s. So in the 40s and 50s, everyone was trying to get a massive overhead press. There weren't high quality squat racks or bench presses yet, so those numbers weren't incredible. Like if you look at the strength feats of that era, you see incredible overhead presses and you see incredible deadlifts, because if you put a barbell in a room, you can lift it off the ground or you can clean it and press it, right? That's the two most kind of strength dominant lifts you can do. So anyway, the bodybuilding routines of the 40s and 50s were all based on full body training 3 to 4 times a week for the most part, focusing on core compound lifts. And I think, that lines up with the research of today, but also when you can only do those kind of movements, it kind of forces you into that style of training. So I think it wasn't just that they fell upon the right combination. It's that when you have more constraints and there's only a few ways you could train, like no one can be like, I only use machines. It's like they don't exist, like 8 exercise options. Then you have limited selection. So I think given the constraints of having primarily barbell and dumbbell based training and having no preconception of isolation movements for the most part, of course, like curls and stuff happened, but there wasn't this emphasis on isolation movements for another couple of decades. I think they fell into this pattern of doing 3 to 4 training sessions, doing full body and focusing on core compound lifts. And we saw some pretty incredible physiques get generated from that. And that does line up more or less with the meta-analytic data we have today. That certainly falls within the zone of optimal. What kind of made things confusing was the advent, it was basically technology ruined everything. We got anabolic steroids and we got isolation machines, and they got promoted together along with like functional isometrics, and marketing made things very confusing. So once anabolic steroids hit the scene, along with Nautilus getting popular and people doing a lot of isolation movements and basically blaming the effects of steroids on isometrics and Nautilus machines, that confused a lot of people. And I think I'm kind of joking. I don't think there's anything wrong with machines or anabolic steroids. It's all good, but it does make things a little more. The more options you have, more variables that you have to account for, the less able you are as an athlete or a coach to pick apart and know which is causing what and what the cause and effect is. And I think that's a big reason why we got into the 80s and we had this camp that was training like Arnold, this body part split, very high volume machines and free weights, spending 2 hours per session in there, and focusing on kind of the volume side of it and the squeeze and pump metabolic effects. And then we had the HIT camp, kind of led by Menser. It was, train infrequently, train to failure, and train with compound movements primarily. And obviously those both work, but it's difficult to tell which one is better than the other when you're confounded by genetics at that level and in different dosing protocols for anabolics. This was a time period where people were just kind of figuring that stuff out. So yeah, in many ways, I would say that the guys in the, like the 30s to the 50s had a lot of things figured out and were probably training more efficiently than people in the late 60s through the 80s. But I don't think it's just that they were like, they just knew everything. I think it was almost kind of this situational constraints where they weren't confused by rapid gains in some people doing something on anabolic steroids. There were no machines available, and they were kind of already training like Olympic weightlifters. So they just found a way to make free weight training work for hypertrophy primarily.
Yeah.
Just
awesome.
to wrap up, if anybody who's watching, obviously it's quite late in the morning at the moment, but when they do watch this rebroadcast, if they do want to contact either yourself or your very, very capable team for coaching, is it still under 3D Muscle Journey?
Yep. Check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. Myself.
3dmusclejourney.com.
Yeah, 3dmusclejourney.com. And that's kind of a good hub for all of the stuff we've talked about. We have links to mass. We have links to my books. We have links to what we call the 3DMJ Vault, which has a mixture of mostly free but some paid courses on becoming a better student of the sport, and also, of course, our coaching. If you want to work with us for bodybuilding or powerlifting prep, or if you're just a serious lifter in the off season, definitely feel free to contact us through our website.
Yeah, I'm going to pop it all on the thing for people to contact through all
Thanks,
the
man.
links.
And I want to add to that, I think if anybody's listening now, also your 3DMJ podcasts are actually brilliant. So if anybody wants to listen to some good info there.
Yeah, whenever I'm driving up, that's always on the iTunes. There's a 3DMJ podcast.
Awesome. That's so cool to hear that. I appreciate that, guys.
Eric, you do have a big following here in South Africa. A lot of people do know you. Just to let you know, we're a small community here, but we're trying to grow it. So, yeah. So
awesome.
Just to let you know.
That it's so, you guys know how it is with, like, you just kind of, you create content and you just put it out to the void. You're like, here's a YouTube channel. Like, I'm not actually George Clooney. I just sit there in a room with the phone, and then I go about my business. So it's always really cool and just surreal to hear that people in a foreign country are following your work, and more than like 2 people. So that's always cool. So very cool.
Awesome. By the way, Andrew weighed in at 298 pounds today. So I think diet down.
Holy shit. That's a big boy. How tall are you?
I'm just over 6 foot, like 6'1".
Okay. If like the only way that's not huge is if you were like, I'm 7'6", so.
He's quite quiet on podcasts. He likes to just sit there.
I don't think I've had enough coffee.
No one ever has.
I'm tired from today's leg session too.
I
bet. Dr. Eric Helms from the Lean Body Show. We are really privileged, and it was fantastic to have you with us tonight. And we look forward to speak to you very soon again. Have a good day on your side. We're about to go to bed. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thanks for being flexible with the time zones, guys, and honored to be on.
Thanks for coming on, Eric. We're very honored to have you. We'll chat to you soon, my friend, and hopefully we'll get you on the show back again soon.
I would love to. It would be a huge honor. Thanks so much for all you guys' time.
Pleasure.